I don't really like outlining anymore. The timing was really fortuitous, and suddenly this little mind mapping company shows up, and what they had invented mapped really, really nicely to the way my mind happens to work.
Welcome, friends. I'm Adrian Sinclair, and this is the Adrian Sinclair Show. And today my guest is Jerry Michalski, who is a very interesting person. And this episode really ties into my previous episode where I spoke with Harlan Hugh, the founder of TheBrain, an awesome mind mapping application. And Jerry has the biggest mind map in the world in terms of using this application, TheBrain. So it's over 400,000 thoughts or nodes in this brain and over 800,000 links. So if you can imagine a mind map of that size, he's been doing it for over 20 years right now, and we're here to explore how he's using it and how this application has helped him do what he does. Hopefully tease out some pro tips of how this can help maybe you organize in this crazy, overflowed with information world that we're in right now. So welcome to the show, Jerry. Thanks for being on the show. I'm really psyched that you are sort of back to back with Harlan when we talked about, sort of the inception of TheBrain, and when I talked to Harlan, I said, you got to introduce me to some interesting people, and he immediately said, like, well, you need to talk to Jerry. You just need to talk to Jerry. That was like his first words, because like you've been using this software for so long, and you've built out this gigantic mind map. Welcome to the show, and let's pick your brain. No pun intended.
Thank you.
Maybe.
Thank you. This is great. Now there's like way too many puns. I mean, the kinds of things you get to say about, brains and the wet one on board. Because once you had like Diet Coke, how do you refer to the original Coke? It becomes Coke Classic, right? So is this like my classic brain? I don't know. So 22, almost in December, it'll be 23 years ago, I was a tech industry trends analyst. So not a Wall Street analyst. I can't, and I don't care what next quarter's earnings are for tech companies. But at the time I was advising, large multinational corporations on whether or not to use neural networks and stuff like that. And I was actually writing an issue of our newsletter about mind mapping and about bookmark or link management on the web. Like, Why is the bookmark feature in your browser so crappy? And then what else could you use? And I was halfway done with the issue, and I was completely frustrated. And a couple weeks earlier, I had booked in my calendar, through email, I got a request for a meeting from this little company called Naturofficial, which had a product called TheBrain. And I'm like, yeah, right, TheBrain. You do a little eye roll because it's like, yeah, whatever. But you're going to hear them out. And then Harlan sits down next to me at the briefing, opens his laptop. And then the moment he starts showing me this little thing with a blue background and some text connected by links, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's kind of how my brain works. I wrote about them in the issue. They became kind of the star of the issue. I invited them to demo their software to debut at our conference every year. So I gave them a little bit of spotlight there. But what I didn't expect is that I'd be using the software 22 plus years later, and that I'd be their lead user, because my brain is sort of the largest man-made brain out there. And if you think about it for a second, the moment they showed up, I was a tech industry trends analyst, and it mattered to me who competed with whom in what sector of the industry, who had funded whom, which PR company was representing which little vendor. All those kinds of things were pieces of data that normally I would just kind of have to remember. And TheBrain was completely perfectly adapted to holding that information and representing it in a way that was more powerful than your average database or other kind of thing. Because I can cruise through the tech industry and show you that, well, they got money from Andreessen Horowitz, which also funded this other company over here, which has these competitors, Right. Or if I meet somebody, I can say, oh, this person founded these 3 other companies earlier in their career, so I know something about them immediately when I hear about their newest venture kind of thing. So all of that to say that the timing was really fortuitous, and suddenly this little mind mapping company shows up, and what they had invented mapped really, really nicely to the way my mind happens to work. And so that combo was kind of magic back then, to the point where 22 years later, I've got like 434,000 nodes called thoughts in my brain, and there isn't a part of my brain that I think of as the dark forest, as like the untouchable zone where I know this whole region of the brain is just a mess. I never go there. Right. There are messier parts, and then whenever I touch anything, I'm always improving it and curating it. Right? I'm always trimming and pruning and whatever. So it's still very high functioning, and in fact, I'm kind of understanding a little bit more about how I use it, so it's getting a little bit higher functioning.
To those who are not familiar with the idea of so when you mention to someone mind mapping, they kind of get the idea of here's a little tree and how things are connected, and it's typically mind mapping software is very static. You can collapse certain things, and what how would you describe the brain application to someone who's like totally new?
Well, yeah, generally I say, do you ever draw like lily pad diagrams on a sheet of paper where you take a word, you circle it, you put another word, you circle it, you draw a line between them, and then you keep going and you draw the linkages between them. It looks like sort of lily pads in a pond. And I say, if you've done that, this software helps you do that. And it's different from outlining, because now when I see outliners, I don't really like outlining anymore, because I have this extra dimensionality, and it's not a lot of dimensionality. Like the brain is not three-dimensional space. I'm not flying through, a z-axis. In fact, I call the brain 2.25D, right? Because many other tools like the brain let you link stuff, but then you run out of room because you crowd the edges of the page. The canvas is this size, and you've got enough words on it that you can't add any more. And the word that you put on this corner can't connect to the one that you put down in the other corner, right? And with the brain, it kind of hops a little bit when you click on something to pull it into the middle. And that little hop is like a mental trigger that says, oh, I just hopped through like a much bigger space. So I call it 2.25D, but it's not confusing like, oh, I now have to fly my way to some new thought that's over there in the distance. So that combination makes it possible to see a lot of stuff and navigate your way through it really quickly in a way that's not overwhelming. So I love that about it.
The software itself is, in my opinion, revolutionary in a sense that it allows you to really build out it's a huge database, but I think the jump thoughts, right, that allow you to kind of connect like totally separate yet somehow associated topics or themes. And, when people think of organizing data, they think of like this classic file cabinet like structure. You got a cabinet, that's this kind of bucket, and then there's these drawers, that's another bucket. Inside you have these manila folders, and inside of that you have data. And then quickly they realize that, oh, well, this piece of data fits well over here, but also fits well over here, and over here, and over here, and over here. And then what do I do with that? Do I have multiple copies? Do I have pointers? The best thing that the operating systems can do right now is sort of like shortcuts or like aliases, which can kind of make you jump from one to the other. But none of that is still very visual. It still sticks to that tree-like structure. And this is a question that I asked Harlan, and I'm curious of what you think about it. Is why is Brain not like the next generation file system, incorporated in like Windows or Linux or Mac OS?
Basically, it's because Harlan didn't listen to me about 15, 20 years ago.
This is going to be good.
And I was like, and that was the time when we started getting sort of Linux laptops. The Linux distributions were coming out, and there was this idea, what if we had a laptop that was clean, that didn't have Windows on it, that didn't have Mac OS on it? But couldn't you sell a pretty cheap laptop if you could slap an open source operating system on it? And then the alternatives to Linux, as a desktop then were GNOME, KDE. There were some really geeky, yucky, lousy desktops, right? And so anybody who's going to try to use Linux was going to get an inferior experience. And I was like, what if you adapt this to be the OS on Linux and just roll it out so that everybody who buys these sort of up and coming and then eventually went away, like it didn't become a big thing because they were hard to use. But what if the OS was actually like the brain? Right. And that idea went no place. But I think that's one reason, because I think it would have been a great idea, and then it could have maybe washed back over into Windows and other things as an alternative desktop or something like that. But there was like a little green field where like the Linux laptops would have been a really nice place to say, and by the way, they're cheaper and they have this really cool operating system that is better than better than the
Right.
desktop metaphor, which was tired then and is exhausted now.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's and we had that conversation with Harlan because he said like, well, it's the people are just so entrenched in thinking how this kind of classical way of structuring data in their under hard drive, like this file cabinet analogy, right, metaphor, and so it's too big of a jump. But I said, well, the same thing sort of happened with smartphones. I mean, when smartphones came out, like it was like these a bunch of different apps, very flat, kind of like and then people just got used to it, right? So it's just yeah, there is a bit of a chasm to go through to kind of jump to the other side, but the upside is huge because it really allows you to do these marvelous things in this application.
Yeah. And it's funny because the brain has always had a problem with uptake, like getting people to start using it and getting people to habituate using it. Because it's only interesting if you continue using it and continue adding to the mind map that you've built, right? And I know other brain users who have thousands of brain data files. They keep making new mind maps. I have the one. Seriously. So the file that I'm looking at right now. Precisely, my precious. The file that I'm looking at behind you right now, because I always have them offset a little bit, is the same file that I started when Harlan visited me 22 and a half years ago, right? And at one point, I don't know, 15 years ago, I created a second brain file around the periodic table of elements just to show somebody at a conference. They were like, how, what, whatever. So I created one, and I got 15 elements in, and I'm like, well, this is stupid. Why wouldn't I want this in my same brain where, everything is deeply intertwinkled, as Ted Nelson told us years ago. And this tool actually loves that. This tool allows me to follow the potato down up to the history of Ireland, down to, immigration into America, over to Trump trying to block immigrants coming into America. And that's a very natural story I can tell in the brain. Right? So I love that about it. And it's unusual because you can't really do that comfortably or easily in other kinds of tools.
Was it the visual aspect of the brain, how it displays data and shows those interconnected links between disparate thoughts that attracted and kept you as the user of it? Or why not just say wiki? I mean, you can create a wiki. It can live on the internet, and you can interlink everything just the same, right? So why not wiki for you?
So the inventor of wikis, Ward Cunningham, lives here in Oregon. I've had lunch with him a couple times at the building where he works downtown. He's now doing something called Smallest Federated Wiki. But when I and my posse, sort of our little crowd, discovered wikis, many of us were completely convinced that we would all be sharing documents with each other inside of wikis. That we would be using wiki naming and wiki inside of wiki namespace linking to create a word that would link to another document that would lead somewhere else and make that. And if you go, the problem with wikis is that Wikipedia completely ate the space. We are not using wikis. We're using Google Docs mostly.
Right.
And by the way, there's a thing called You Need a Wiki, YNAW. If you Google You Need a Wiki, it sort of sucks in, you give it permissions to your Google Docs space, and it turns it into kind of a wiki, except there's a couple little deal breakers in there where it's not designed just right, but it's a great idea, right? Because if Google decided to add a little bit of functionality, a set of Google Docs could act just like a wiki. But they didn't. And so the problem is that the brain has an expressive capacity that's different from what wikis do. And Michelle Bowens has the Peer-to-Peer Foundation Wiki, which is genius and has too many words. Like, I can't make it through the pages. I can't see a context. And in my brain, I can take the same exact topic that Michelle has done something really well with words on a wiki page, but I can give you a visual little snapshot. So it is kind of the visual presentation, where when you see an idea, a person, an aha from a TED Talk or whatever, it just kind of leaps out, and then you can pursue it through other documents, other places, in a different and complementary and, to me, more interesting way than what wikis can represent. So I'm a giant fan of wikis, and I wish that they had done better in sort of the general public usage. But to me, what the brain does is somehow different and complementary, yet not really that connected. So one last thing I'll say about that is I use Wikipedia pages a lot in my brain. So you can connect a link to the web, to any website, to any thought, any of these nodes. And the cool thing is that you can just write a thought that's just words. It doesn't have to have a link connected to it, which some other tools, you can only sort of make a node when it has a link. And this one, you just put words in. And so very often, if there's a concept like the element carbon, or the notion of a periodic table of elements, or Mendeleev, every one of those thoughts in my brain, I am positive is connected to the Wikipedia page for carbon, periodic table of elements, and Mendeleev. And so that's kind of cool. So in that sense, there's a big complementarity, but the tools are not linked in any other way, right? There's no better integration, and I sure wish there were.
When brainstorming, coming up with a lot of different thoughts that are interconnected, that have a relationship, and what the beauty of the Brain application, the software, is that not only does it allow you to create thoughts and relationships, how these thoughts are connected, you can label the connection what it is. Is it a parent of this? Is it what you want? You can label the relationship. So it's really good for like brainstorming, because you can quickly pump out a lot of different thoughts and see how they are connected. The difficulty that I see sometimes when I use it is that when I break a topic into these thoughts, I want to still have like a congealed one sort of like document. So I can have like a thought on something, and in the notes section of that thought, I'm going to put some notes, and then I'm going to jump into another thought, right? And I have a notes section over there, and I have some notes over there, and I wish I had like one document that has all of those yet connected. So separate but connected. How are you dealing with that?
So it's really interesting. I had a Zoom call 5 years ago or something with two other black belt brain users, and it turned out that we each use the brain extremely differently, like really differently. One of them was the person I just described, who like every 5 times a day would create a new brain file, and I'm like, I could not comprehend it. It just made no sense to me at all. And he was using every deep feature of the brain. He was using not just labels and types and all that, because you can do thought types and link types and all that, all of which came, I don't know, halfway through the lifetime of the brain. Like when the brain shipped 22 and a half years ago, there were no types, right? There were no favicons. You couldn't see what the link might be. Those have been later features. I use the brain in this incredibly primitive way, almost like it shipped out of the box 22 years ago. So I don't use labels and I don't use types. And I chose not to, partly because it creates visual confusion, partly because it adds time to building something, to adding something to the brain. And to me, every additional gesture it takes to do something dramatically decreases the likelihood you're going to actually try to do that again the next time. I call this the law of convenience. I wrote about it in 2002, I think. And it may have inspired actually Jeff Bezos to do one-click ordering. Because what I was saying was every additional step that it takes to get something done catastrophically reduces your likelihood you're going to try to do that thing. And so if there were an AI that could listen to me or watch me as I'm adding stuff to my brain, and when I added a book would go, hey, Jerry, that looks like a book. Shall I tag it with metadata as a book? And shall I go find the author and find the other things she's written? I would be like, game on, let's do it. But guess what? There's no API, so there's no AI, so there's no assistance. So I bailed on adding metadata because, right? So I use the brain in a really primitive way, and I don't ever use it for simple brainstorming. So the question you just asked about, and then you have notes, and I don't use the notes field much at all either. Because early on, I was like, I don't want my brain data file to get huge, so I don't embed things in it. I don't create documents and originate them in the notes field. I hardly use the notes field at all, which means the way most people present their brain, which is portrait mode with notes next to the brain, I can't stand that view. Because I only like the brain in landscape view because the words and phrases need to be immediately visible. And I hardly use the notes field at all. So I brainstorm in other tools. I'll brainstorm in a Google Doc, I'll brainstorm elsewhere, and I think of my brain as my lasting memory, which has, the insights and the nuggets, the shiny nuggets of goodness that I run across. Those should live in the mind map. And then I connect the documents up to those, and I hyperconnect those, and that turns out to work really, really well. But I wish I could use my brain for writing a document like you just described. right?
Yeah.
And so, and if you let me wander just for a second more, and this will actually bridge back to wikis. There's a friend of mine, Kenneth Tyler, lives in South Berkeley, and he used to have a wiki called Seed Wiki that he created, and it's deprecated, so you can no longer find Seed Wiki or the fun experiments he and I did. But at one point, we were using Seed Wiki to be PowerPoint, and we were using Seed Wiki to be a blog. And the insight was, PowerPoint, a slide deck, is just a series of pages that have a directory, a table of contents of which page to go to next when you hit the right arrow, right? So all he did was he had coded SeedWiki, so he made it so that one page was the playlist. It was just a playlist of pages, and I could sort them and reorder them. And then each page I would edit separately, but when I hit play at the top of a playlist, it would just blow away everything on the screen, give me a right and left button, and click, click, click. And then what happens is, any page in your wiki namespace becomes a candidate page in any presentation, which is not what PowerPoint does. What PowerPoint and Keynote do is all the pages are trapped in a version, and then you have a version control nightmare, which is why I have leaped over to Google Slides, where you can collaborate and you don't have a version control nightmare, sort of, but you still kind of do. Right? Because I don't remember which snapshot and which presentation I actually had that slide I really love. I don't know where it was, but if it was in the namespace and if it was in like a brain map space and all I had was a playlist that said, on August 4th of 2016, I gave a presentation that had these slides with that timestamp. And I could then go back and replay exactly the presentation I did on that day. That would be fabulous. So a presentation like PowerPoint is just a playlist with a bunch of pages. A blog is just a playlist that's reverse chronological, and you put it's one page, but you fold the pages together and pretend they're one page, right? Because blog entry can be a wiki page. Who cares, right? And so you can emulate a blog, piece of cake, no big deal, no great shakes. Right. And then he emulated the brain a little bit by just using frames in a page. So he had a frame at the top, which was parent thoughts, a frame in the middle, which was the active thought, and then a frame below for child thoughts. And I don't remember what else he did. And it was just a mock-up, and we were goofing around. But it was really, really interesting to me. And I'll add one last thing, which is my wife is right now writing a book. She's using Scrivener, which is software for writing books, right? Don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's pretty good. So it's called Scrivener after Bartleby the Scrivener, which is a Herman Melville short story. And try to move a chapter from one manuscript to another in your Scrivener app. It is almost impossible. You can, within a manuscript, you basically say, I want to write a book about this. Within a manuscript, you can just slide stuff around and move it pretty easy. It's optimized for that. Almost impossible to cross manuscript boundaries. You have to duplicate it, delete it's terrible. It's like really bad. I just want a manuscript to be a table of contents to a series of nuggets that exist in this namespace. Why has nobody invented this? Right? So where we're heading, I think, is toward more interesting, more flexible, more open, more connected tools for thinking, sharing, storytelling, connecting, having insights, brainstorming, and then creating documents that come out of that, which might be a presentation, might be a blog, might be a book, might be a something else. And we haven't gotten there. We're still stuck. I like to say, this is a very simple analogy, but in the early cinema days, we put a tripod with a moving camera in front of a stage because everybody knew what a theater was. And then somebody invents panning, and then somebody invents zooming, and then somebody invents the cut, the jump cut, and then Eisenstein invents the montage, and suddenly we're off and running and we have a whole new vocabulary for cinema. We don't have that. We're stuck on the goddamn desktop metaphor. Yeah. We are trapped. We are like, and Harlan, at one point 10, 12 years ago, he started showing me, he did a WebEx and was showing me a demo of the next version of TheBrain, and he was about to tie it to the Finder so that anytime I created a new node, a new thought, it would spawn a new folder in the Finder. And 5 minutes into the demo, I said, "Permission to speak freely, sir." And he nervous laughter back. And I'm like, what are you doing? You're going to tie the brain, which is this lovely, non-directed, non-hierarchical thing.
Its own thing, yeah.
To a hierarchical software that's the slowest, dumbest piece of software on my computer. And the next day he sent me a very nice email that said, half the company was trying to tell me what you told me yesterday, but I wasn't really listening.
I relate to what you said in some of the frustrations in terms of using the brain as a tool to maybe even similarly to a slide deck, a tool to tell a story. It's great for like this repository of everything that shows relationship between the different thoughts. But typically what happens in our brains is that we can kind of recall a storyline, right? And that's actually one of the methods of memorizing something. I forget who was the Greek...
the memory castle of Matteo Ricci. The memory palaces.
Yeah.
Or you're thinking further. In Greece, there was also some different mnemonic devices.
Exactly. I'm thinking like, I don't know. But it was a method of basically going through a path that you memorize in your brain because you've been doing it for so long.
Maimonides of Ceos.
And then you attach things. And then you attach things. Yeah. And then you attach things along that path. And it would be so great if brain would allow you to sort of like paint that path so you could sequentially kind of have it play, just like the slide deck that you mentioned, right? Right.
But it sort of does that. Depends on how you use it, of course. And we all, like, as I said, you scratch 3 brain users and we use it in 6 different ways. I can tell stories in my brain, using my brain the way you just described. And I've got a couple of those videos out. There's one on the history of the potato, for example. There's one on Nikola Tesla and the genius that he was and how many things he invented, right? And the thing is, I know where those paths are because I know what's connected to what, and I can sort of tell that story because I'm like, oh, I need to go here, I need to go here.
Right.
Those paths don't yell out to the average person visiting.
Exactly.
Now, I'm also a Prezi user. I happen to really like Prezi, which is a little Hungarian company that has this kind of a zoomable whiteboard. Prezi is earlier than Miro and Mural, which are very popular right now. But the cool magic in Prezi is that you declare a path through all the objects you put in your Prezi, and then you hit right arrow, right arrow, right arrow,
and it just takes you through.
And it goes visually zooming and moving through the path, which is completely cool. If the brain had a playlist function where I could visit nodes, done, right? We're done.
That's exactly
what I was thinking. But there's no record and play feature. There's no playlist feature. I can't dictate a path. And the tool is proprietary and closed.
Right.
So nobody else gets to play with it. So
I think we need to talk to Harlan.
And, I'm trying. I've been trying for 20 years.
It's I think it will be fairly easy implementation because it's not too, I'd say it's not too difficult to do that because it's a sequence of events that you basically have to record or basically tell the brain. It's really not that difficult to implement.
Just tell. I think there's a wander feature you can turn on, which lets it randomly pick a path, through the brain. No big deal. There's just not a, hey, play this sequence of thoughts, right? And then maybe record my voiceover or something. I mean, so I do a lot of screencasts where I use Telestream, ScreenFlow, to record me talking over the brain. And I've got to do all this sort of manual labor and remember what the path was because I can't declare it ahead of time.
Exactly. And that's the easy feature that could be implemented of like, we know it, like, because it's your brain, so you know like which path to take. But if I want to take someone through 400, plus 1,000 nodes and show them the path that they should follow without losing the way, there's really no easy way of doing that. And so that's kind of like one of the things that I think would be easily implementable in the brain and kind of up the game and make it more usable, because now you literally could, the analogy would be, the metaphor would be telling a story, because it's kind of like telling a story. All these thoughts that are connected to these nodes, but the story is a specific path that you take the viewer through that journey. What other frustrations do you have, or suggestions that you've had? One of the things that when I spoke with Harlan is, of course, I had to mention 3D Brain, and of course obviously everybody thought about 3D Brain, and he said, yeah, we even tried it, we built one, and it didn't really, because there's really not easy way of navigating through it, even though it is kind of analogous to our own 3D brains, right? Because things are happening over here in our brains in 3D. So it's the navigation, I think, was the issue. But I said, like, well, VR is getting better and better. And I think soon when tactile apparatuses will come out, like gloves that will be able to feel things. Maybe it will let you navigate through things much easier. So
right.
maybe it's in the future.
So a couple things. Number one, there's a whole lot of visualization tools out there that look really sexy. They're just really pretty. Whoever designed them had a great aesthetic sense. They're completely useless. They just are not useful. And you see this hairball, and you're like, okay, good. What do I learn from the hairball?
Right.
Not a lot.
Right.
And so what I love about the brain is that it does one thing, or sort of a couple things really well, but they're very useful things. And the way that I've adapted my brain to using this brain software seems to work really well together so that it's very high functioning. But then I see all kinds of other tools. And I called the brain 2.25D, not 3D, because I think that flying through 3D spaces is really, really hard. And at one point, I was at a conference where the next speaker was going to use, I'm forgetting what it was, Second Life, I think he was going to use to demonstrate a brainstorming session between two people. So I typed in, there was a live chat next to, up on stage. And I typed into the chat, watch, this is going to take forever to set up. This is going to be really clumsy. And sure enough, he had to get his avatar to go over to the little whiteboard. He had to set it up so that we could kind of see over his shoulder, whatever. And then after quite, an interminable delay, they could start interacting in a way that you would do in Google Docs like that. And I was like, see? And that was not flying through an information space, which is a whole different thing, and is also really problematic, unless there's actually a Z dimension to the data. So if you're trying to navigate your hard drive or some, data coming out of COVID research, and that has dimensionality, and you can flip the dimensions and go, then 3D is fabulous, like go crazy. So I have yet to see, I'm open to seeing it, I'd love to see it, but I have yet to see a 3D thing like the brain that actually works. On the other hand, augmented reality is really interesting. And I had a conversation years ago with a hardware engineer from the Google Glass team. And he told me, like, within 5 minutes, we determined that the screen resolution of Google Glass was nowhere near enough to faithfully help with the brain. Like, that wasn't going to happen. But, there's all kinds of other AR research going on, so we kept talking. But the idea here is, imagine you were walking around and the things you had in your brain were available to you, overlaid and contrasted or compared next to things that your system would know about you. Like, I know what location Jerry's in, so I know what building he's looking at, so I know who occupies the second floor. So, there's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff you could do, and which might include a data glove and a Minority Report kind of thing, like you were sort of alluding to as you were opening this question. And I think that's interesting. So I attended, I'm in Portland, and I attended a Microsoft HoloLens meetup for a couple of sessions, and just got no traction, no interest, nothing, like crickets. And I'm like, maybe not the time, maybe not this crowd, don't know. But I'm a sort of a VR, AR, XR skeptic at this point still.
Right. I definitely agree with you in terms of how a lot of visualization that we see, especially like rendered in either movies or shows where there's like this sexy 3D, especially when there's some kind of a context of like hackers and hacking, they're like flying through space. It's like all this mumbo jumbo that's like has absolutely no, connection to reality, how it looks in reality. But it looks sexy, and people are like, wow, okay, that's how it should be. But then, when you actually present something like that, the utility of it is unless, like you said, it's connected to something that Z-axis or that third dimension has a function, maybe even like time. So like, here's your thoughts, and you can literally just kind of move through time in that. Which, so what I gather from what you said is that not a lot of, so some things translate, some things miserably fail when try to be translated from analogous systems.
Yeah. And also, the brain is one of many different ways of visualizing things. So I'm a black belt brain user. A friend of mine tried to teach me to use Kumu, so Kumu.io, which is really good systems diagramming tool. Like, if you were trying to model the food system or soil fertility and the food system and health and all that, Kumu would be a really great tool to do that in. I apparently just cannot think in Kumu. I'm not good at it. But I'm extremely interested in how these tools complement each other and what is the suite of tools which, if they were more open and more collaborative and more interconnected, and if they were working on shared data, if they could see and improve shared, distributed, trustworthy data, how would that improve our ability to make good decisions? Because, and here I'm going somewhere else entirely, but it's important, one of the big lessons from 20 plus years of me using the brain, and I have a thought in my brain called Lessons from Using the Brain. The biggest, most important one is that we are an amnesic civilization. That we are normally pretty smart humans, but we're stupider than we normally would be because we're drowning in the info torrent and we don't have tools that help us curate what we know and share it out to others and tell meaningful stories with it. And agree that this thing over here, the lie that Trump said yesterday, we've all agreed is a lie. And the next time he says that lie, we've agreed we're going to leave the room. We don't have that because we don't have a place to say we've all agreed this is a lie. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I think that we as a civilization are stupider and easier to spin, never mind we've been treated as mere consumers for 50 years instead of as citizens. And that's a whole other thread that I care about a lot, because my whole philosophical flow that ends right now with the word trust starts 25, 30 years ago, about the same time as the brain shows up in my life with the word consumer. So I realized back then when I'm a tech analyst that I hate the word consumer. And that by being treated as mere consumers, we've been made stupider. So all of this ties back to, if we had better tools for remembering what we know, questioning ourselves, basically iterating on that with each other, alone, with each other, together in larger places, as part of video storytelling and so forth, we might actually be able to advance our civilization a bit.
Right. I like goosebumps when you say that, because I so resonate with the fact that we are drowning in information and yet we are forgetting the things that are like the lessons learned. It's like we're sort of book smart but execution dumb. We have access to all this information, but we don't have the distilled knowledge things that would save our bacon on more than one occasion. And that's where I was looking into the brain to allow me to find those things, because we can know a lot of knowledge, but if we don't implement it, if we don't have some kind of tool that allows us, like, hey, remember that thing you did last time that you've learned from, like, it was a bad mistake, but you've learned from it. This should bubble up for you right now, so you wouldn't make that same mistake. And so desperately looking for tools that allow you to do that, because what we end up with inevitably is a bunch of documents. Here's a document with some notes. Here's another document with some notes. Here's another document with some notes. Some overlap, some duplicates. They're all over the place. Maybe Google will help you find some of that stuff, but if you don't have a consistent, or maybe just one place to sort of like your brain where you can kind of store all of it, then we're in trouble.
And what you've just described, which I agree with 100%, would be bad enough if there weren't a whole bunch of people in the world who've discovered that you can undermine facts, undermine trust in civilization, and destroy things and win elections by screwing up the information space and flooding us with disinformation, malinformation, and worse. And there's a nice documentary called Hypernormalization by a BBC documentarian named Adam Curtis. He's done a bunch of good documentaries. I really like Hypernormalization because his thesis is we are already in a nonlinear war. We just don't realize it. And in a nonlinear war, basically, information is cheaper than guns and bombs. So if I can, like, there in the last 10 years, there's been a gigantic shift to the far right worldwide. It's not just Trump; it's Bolsonaro, Duterte, Orban, in Poland. Two brothers, one of whom was like liberal and awesome, dies in a plane wreck, along with most of his government. And guess who shows up, right? And Poland is now an illiberal democracy. So have you heard that term?
No.
So an illiberal democracy. So liberal democracy is the thing we think we're in. illiberal democracy looks and smells like a democracy. There's a court system, there's a media, there's, whatever. But guess what? They've all been corrupted. So the media has been squished and suppressed, and anybody who was actually writing good news stories was kicked out of the country, or their presses were destroyed, or whatever. And that's happening now in lots of countries. Turkey, for example, just is destroying the last free index.hu, I think. No, maybe it's Hungary. One of those countries that's sort of really under pressure right now is exactly doing that right now, so that they'll still have elections, but it's not actually a functioning democracy. And that's where we're going, because we are easier to spin, because we don't have tools to show what we know and share it and improve it, because we're drowning in the info torrent, which is being polluted on purpose.
Yeah, that's a hammer that really hits that on the head of the nail, right? It's the news cycle is so fast. The torrent of information, constant barrage of data that's hitting us. And on top of that, all of that is magnified by social media, which just the way it's engineered with the dings, with the dopamine little hits of like notifications and everything, which curates this, which actually takes it to the next level, because it conditions people to actually expect that kind of drip type of information dosing, which quickly says, oh, wait, look at me. Okay, that was interesting. No, wait, there's another one, and you just kind of like, you can't hold attention. And that's where the facts get lost, because even if someone told you like, look, this is for a fact, here's all the proof, here's all the connections, just like you have it in your brain where you have a topic and you're like, here's all the things that I found in terms of substantiating this, here's some things that contradicted, but here's like all the sources and everything. You have that availability of that data, but the time to paint that story, to tell someone, is going to be already hijacked by another thing that kind of slides in, and here's that train that just kind of moves, and there you go, bye, and there's just new stuff. So how do we deal with that? What do you think? What's gonna, like, how do we what's the solution, or what can we do?
So I think it's hard, because I think there's kind of titanic battles going on over the scripts that are in our heads, over what we think is real or true, or what we think the good life looks like, and all that. And these are not new battles, like these battles, Marxism versus capitalism, or you name it, the sophists and the Platonists way back in ancient Greek. So this battle is ongoing all the time. And the one we're living through right now is sort of the neoliberal Washington consensus, neoclassical economics agenda, which is being actively broken and undermined at this moment. I can point to, and I collect in my brain, dozens of initiative movements, projects, well-funded groups that are proposing alternatives to this worldview that GDP is a horrible measure of progress or well-being. Profit maximization is a really stupid way to run a country if you expect the humans to survive. I mean, there's all these kinds of things that are under active rethinking right now, but none of the new ones has caught on. And our ability to have this conversation has kind of gone away, sort of on purpose. I know many, many families where in the U.S., for over Thanksgiving, it's like, don't talk to Uncle Bob about politics or religion. That always ends badly. Right. I love talking about politics and religion. Give me more, right? But I'd love it even more if we could share over time and just draw out this conversation so that we could, in fact, learn from each other and shift our points of view a little bit. I'm in the process right now of listening with care to people who are on the other side of the political fence from me, representing a lot of what they think in my brain as faithfully as I can, and then walking through the arguments and trying to map, like, yes, no, what would you say against this? How does this work? And I don't know that many of us are doing this kind of thing. So in the meantime, everything you just described about the current media platforms, their business model is basically to addict us and then hoover up all of our private data and sell that off to people who want to stimulate us to buy more stuff. We're being treated as consumers instead of citizens, and I can only think what benefits might have accrued had Zuckerberg been thinking about citizenship instead of about the cute women at Harvard when he first started the Facebook. Right? Because if you read his early messages, he was dogging babes. That's what he was doing. He did not have any ulterior motive, of a virtuous ulterior motive when he started this thing. I'm surprised he had one.
Well, the issue with that I see with social media right now is, even though we call it social media, it really has been hijacked by the profit motive, right? It is all driven by advertising, about big data, about collecting information. And, I get it. I mean, they have to run a business. It takes massive data centers to do everything that we wanted to do at a speed of a click.
You could fund it differently.
I'm sure you could. But that's kind of the model that,
$1 billion company.
Right, exactly. And so that profit motive is what really is, in my opinion, just kind of skewing everything, because you have if funny cats get 20 million clicks, then guess what people will be producing? Funny cats, funny animals, funny whatever, or whatever is catching people's attention. And that is getting the most advertising. And so that kind of scale just goes in that direction. And then not even by design, but by just this mechanism of this profit motive, the other stuff that's important, that someone took time to produce content, to curate it, to is not going to have as many eyeballs on it, because not a lot of advertising is going to be associated with it, so it's not going to get promoted. Algorithms will basically suppress it, or just going to go away. And so that is, I think, the biggest kind of evil that I see as a mechanism. And I don't know what the solution to that is. Maybe eventually distributed systems. We have a lot of work that's being done in the cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger systems. And I believe that maybe at some point, I had this idea many years ago, probably 20 years ago, when it's like, well, at some point everybody's going to be connected. Everybody's going to have a phone that's going to be connected to the internet. So literally everybody has a server. And so you could build a mesh network of a purely distributed computational network. And so in that kind of topology of information allocation, you could do things that would not be centralized and would not be focused on that one motive, because it has to be one profit motive, because it's in this one place. I believe that's still ahead of us. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think that's probably one of the cures that could eventually dislodge some of the power of these huge data houses, the Googles, the Facebooks, and so on.
So a couple things. I'm not a big fan of blockchain, but I'm a big fan of distributed open data, ledgers, whatever. Blockchain is often called a trustless system, basically because you don't need trust. Look, everything is irrefutable. It's irrevocable on the blockchain. I'm like, really? No. Because how did the information actually get put on the blockchain, right? There's a whole bunch of ways in which this thing breaks constantly, including on side chains and a bunch of things where you break some of the fundamental rules of what makes a blockchain actually safe and trustworthy. Right. And people are doing that left, right, and center. So I don't really like that, but I'm friends with Arthur Brock, who is part of Holochain, which is an alternative architecture to blockchain, which I like a lot, because I happen to know that Arthur and his couple of colleagues who've been thinking hard for 25 years have thought much deeper about a whole series of other aspects about how people relate and how we might fix civilization. So I think that there's a whole DApp, distributed data, distributed linked open data. There's a whole series of really interesting efforts to try to sort this out, so that we might all run some piece of the larger infrastructure together. And I think maybe we get there, but then if you sit down and you go, how would I replicate Facebook's functionality today using these DApp tools? You come up with like a big zero. You're totally stuck. You cannot replicate it. It's not, we don't have the piece parts. It's not done yet. Right? And so let me go back to your question, which is what's the way forward? And I go back to trust. I think trust is the way forward. And I say that with complete realism, knowing that I just said that trust is being actively undermined, that we are being drowned in misinformation, that those people are winning elections, and there's this huge shift in public politics around the world about undermining trust. And I actually think that all of our institutions have been designed from mistrust of the average person, and the way to fix things is to start rethinking our institutions, from education to the food system to these platforms, from a basis of trust, which means assuming that the average person has good intentions and would like to figure out how to help, and that there are bad actors, but we don't have to design the systems up front to prevent everybody from acting badly, because then we cut the genius out of the room. I have a lot of stuff online about this.
Right. So let's kind of bring this back into how you kind of documented that in TheBrain, because I know you're very passionate about trust and building that as a sort of like the foundation. And what have you found in your, well, I have two things. Let me just kind of roll back, because I had this question just kind of queued up in my brain for like the last half an hour that I wanted to ask you, which is, given that you are using TheBrain in its sort of like almost 1.0, the way it was designed, without using the notes as much or tagging and labeling things, these nodes in the brain. So basically everything is around the name of the thought itself, right? How do you deal with and the links? Over 400,000 of these thoughts, which may include like links to external resources or just maybe concepts. How do you deal with the issue of duplication, in terms of, you want them to be long, but not too long. You want them to be descriptive, but not too long, so that when they display in the Plex, meaning that you have all these different thoughts on the canvas and interconnections between them, the links, that they don't kind of overcrowd the space. How did you find balance, and how did you solve that problem, if you did?
So several things. One is, you're completely exactly right about naming thoughts. Each node is called a thought, and the names cannot be too long. And a friend of mine was selling access to a brain that had really long thought names, and I'm like, I couldn't read it. I just couldn't make my way through it. It was hard to process. And since then, he's sort of modified it. His thoughts are much more readable. Another way is that I don't ever want or need to see the big hairball view of my brain data. So I may have 430,000 thoughts in it, linked by more than 800,000 links, all put in by me by hand over 22 years. I'm the only person who's fed my brain, and I've never done an automatic crawl of any website or anything like that. So it's all me. And I don't care what the hairball looks like. It's completely uninteresting to me. And every screenful, because of a simple couple choices that Harlan made way back when he invented TheBrain, every screenful is actually crisp and full of information for me, and makes complete sense to my brain, the one on board. And so when that space gets a little crowded, what I do is I start creating collective nodes. So the first thing I do, usually under some concept, let's say immigration, I will create a sub-thought always called articles about immigration. So articles about whatever this thing is, when it gets crowded, I always color that yellow to attract attention, so that somebody else besides me can come see it, and so that I see it more easily. And then I'll take all of the newspaper articles, blog posts, tweets, videos, and books that I've already put under immigration. I will quickly move them over, because editing is pretty easy in TheBrain. I'll move them over under articles about X. So that cleans up the space right away. And now I have major concepts, major companies, whatever, movements, standards, I don't know what it is, right? Issues. And then I'll create sub-issues. I'm always trying to create well-named, because the naming is so vastly important. I'm always trying to create well-named nodes that then collect up a bunch of info. And recently I had a big aha, where I created a thought called My Ahas, about food, agriculture, soil. Because I realized one day that I had a whole bunch of stuff on soil fertility. I had a whole bunch of stuff on fungus, mycelium, the beneficial uses of mushrooms. I had a whole bunch of stuff on natural farming, the no-till farming, the one-straw revolution. And I created this one node to kind of link them all together. And then I started deriving principles out of these, which are metaphorically useful if you're trying to rebuild, society. And then one other tiny thing, which is, when I add something new to my brain these days, I usually look for it first in my brain, because one time in 3, I've already got the thing in there, and I'll find it. And the good news about TheBrain, if you use the linkages a lot, is that you can get near the thought just because you can think of something that was nearby to where it should be. It's a little bit like
association.
Exactly.
Retracing.
So I may not remember the name of the thing, but I remember one of the companies that was doing a similar thing, or remember a person who was the founder of one of the companies that was doing the same thing. And that way I can kind of back up into the neighborhood, and when I look around the neighborhood, I can see that it's not there or whatever. And then periodically, but not that often, I do find duplicates. I quickly pair them up. I then eliminate one. I link everything to the other one, get rid of one, and clean it up.
Was it a mindset change that you had to go through to kind of let go? Because I find it that it's always kind of a battle against like the entrenched way of thinking about organizing data, which is like, I want a bucket, I want a bigger bucket, I want this to be in this, to kind of have everything neatly structured in that kind of tree-like construct. And with the brain, you have to sort of, I believe, like at least I do, you have to let go at some point of that notion of being able to neatly group everything, because not everything fits in these discrete buckets, and some things live in many buckets, right? So have you had that kind of moment where you were like, as you were building this over 22 years, where you were like, I just will trust that this is gonna be found in the future by what we just described, which is the associative path, so to speak, right? You think about one thing, like you're trying to recall something. If you can't recall the thing that you're trying to recall, you're like, well, what is kind of connected to it? And by association, you find whether it's company or name, and then that kind of leads you on that path, and you're like, aha, found you. And so, but it takes that, I gotta let go. I know it's in there somewhere.
So I think I had the opposite reaction of what you just described. Like almost and I don't know if this is actually an opposite, but let me explain.
Tell me about it.
I've always felt unnaturally constrained by stupid hierarchies and outlining systems and systems that didn't allow for linking to map or represent the actual rich linkages that happen in the real world. So I've always felt like most tools were stupid and sucky because they didn't let me do that. And then Harlan shows up, opens his laptop sitting next to me 22 and a half years ago in New York City in our conference room, and I see a tool that lets me do that. So I didn't feel like, how am I going to let go of the need to structure and the nice tidy buckets? I was like, shit, here's a tool that actually lets me represent things the way I see them, the way that they need to be represented, and maybe not enough. So for me, I felt liberated into the tool, and I took to it like a duck takes to water. I didn't need anybody coaxing me. Like when you're running a blog or a podcast, you're like, what am I going to write about tomorrow? I got to think of something. I have in 22 years, I've never had a day when I thought, oh, what am I going to add to my brain? Because every day has apparently 50 things worth remembering. Because if you do the math on 435,000 things over 22 and a half years, it turns out to about 50 a day. And that means that I'm always curating things into my brain because I'm seeing things worth remembering, whether it's a cocktail recipe or the latest idiotic Trump tweet, or what are we going to do about fixing civilization, or who has had great ideas that might actually fix civilization, right? And I ask people, what would your life be like if you had a bin where you could trust, in a trustworthy way, find again the best possible things you had seen for the last couple decades, and they were kind of collected together.
Right.
And they were overlinked because that's the only way you find your way back to them, right? Yeah. Like you just were saying. You need proximity, and in order to have proximity, you need to actually be generous in your linking out. And I've seen a couple people who use the brain as a hierarchy, and you had to chase on down, and they weren't using the lateral links at all, and their brain was terrible.
What's the point? Yeah.
It was worthless. It was like, wow, why did you do this? You're not actually using the power of this tool.
Right. Okay, let me ask you this. You've been using this for over 20 years. And it seems like even over time you have changed some aspects. I mean, sounds like you've done some color coding in terms of like highlighting, almost like a color legend of things, what things represent.
Just two colors though.
I
don't like multicolor.
I like that minimalism in you, man. It's like, hey, just keep it the way it was original. It's great. Keep it simple. Keep it simple. The KISS method, principle. What if what would be like the three or more, if you choose to elaborate, features that you would love in Brain to, like in the next version of Brain? If you would have that moment with Harlan, he's like, listen, I'm open to anything. What would those three suggestions be?
I'd love him to open source the software so that other people could use it, riff on it, improve it, do something different with it.
Right.
I would love for there to be APIs so that, for example, artificial intelligence can be wired up to it. because I would love to have a trustworthy listener app that's watching me use the brain and picks up and takes over all the stupid, idiot manual things that I end up doing, right? So I end up having to clean up URLs manually because I don't, all the marketing part after the question mark in the URL, that's trash. And also that makes the URL not, unique in a way I don't want it to be. Because if I put the same company in twice, I just want the clean URL for the company so that the brain will tell me, oh yeah, you've already got these people, right? And then it'll lead me to them. Where if I leave all that trailer stuff, then I have a unique URL which I don't want.
Right.
So I do a whole bunch of manual stuff which could be automated away. AI could be insanely helpful. And then I would like to be able to compare my brain to your brain and then go back to my brain. Meaning, I would like a tool where you and I can start talking while sharing this. So I'm completely frustrated because my brain is sitting over here on the side next to the display where I'm talking with you in a tab in my Chrome browser. And we don't have screen sharing, so I couldn't share my brain. But even if I could, and you're a brain user, which is unusual. I seldom am in conversation with other brain users. But it would be lovely if we could have sort of compared these ideas, and then if I saw something you had done in your brain that I liked, I could say, awesome, link to that by reference from my brain. And I will trust that as you continue exploring this thing, I will continue learning about it. And we could then create these little mycelial connections through what we care about, right? So and just by analogy, a long time ago, I used an early genealogical website. It wasn't Ancestry or anything. And at one point I was thinking about, for each person you put in, a birth record, death record, marriage, whatever, and at some point it's a real person and a real entry. And then every now and then, it's already in the database because it's in somebody else's family tree.
Right.
So you might be lucky enough to have this moment where you just clicked into somebody else's family tree, which gives you this feeling like you just clicked into the giant family tree of all humanity.
Right.
Because that happens a lot, and we start to make these links and figure out who was born where. We then have like the bigger map, which is really interesting. And so I'm talking analogously of what if we could do that with ideas, events, articles, interesting nuggets, all of that. That's where this thing could go. That's the potential of this. And my main project these days is called Open Global Mind, and you can go to openglobalmind.com and join the conversation. That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, so tell me more about that, because that's very intriguing to me, the kind of interlinking of the brains. I mean, in a way, you could do things like that, like even using wikis. Again, we're sidestepping away from the visual aspect of the brain, which allows you to kind of see these things at a sort of like from a bird's eye view, so to speak, so you can see things and not just a flat document with hyperlinks which you don't see where they go unless you click on them, open them in a tab, or it's a messy proposition. But in a way, you could do that using wikis, where you kind of like, here's my wiki, here's your wiki, and we can kind of interconnect some of those cross-reference things. But obviously, it's not going to be the visual aspect of the brain, which is a huge component of why this software is actually, so useful. So tell me a little bit more about this project that you just mentioned.
So Open Global Mind is kind of about open-mindedness. So there's a piece of it that's very geeky, very much about things like TheBrain and Kumu and Idea Flow and Mind Mapper, and there's like hundreds, and I've got them cataloged in my brain. I'd love to be sharing them with you right now. But there's hundreds of tools that are different kinds of visualizations that are very useful, and they don't replace each other. They're and I don't know what the canonical 6 or 15 or of them are, and I kind of don't care that there need to be 15 canonical ones. But there's a layer of Open Global Mind which is very geeky about these tools and how to make them more open, more interoperable, more powerful, more available. Then there's a layer above which has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with, we have been intentionally set against the other. We are otherizing like crazy. We are afraid to talk over the cultural divide. We fear the people on the other side, and this fear is being pumped. How do we sit down together and lower that fear? And maybe look down into this OGM platform and go, oh, I would like to explain something, and here's a really great tool for telling that story or illustrating that data. Like we saw yesterday in the Axios interview with Trump, where poor Jonathan Swan, where Trump is pulling out sheets of paper and saying, well, no, we're the lowest, we're the best. And Trump is like, and Swan is like, no, you're not. The US is like near the worst. And we can't We can't even agree with the President of the United States that the United States response to coronavirus is a shit show. We can't even have that conversation. Never mind across the Thanksgiving table with Uncle Bob, right? The president of the goddamn country is avoiding this issue. So how do we get there?
Right.
And how do we make it so that elections aren't this titanic battle of wills where everybody's pulling out all the stops because whoever has the least to lose is going to win, right? I want us to win together so that we make a better civilization that we're all happier to be in.
So it
and
sounds
I think
like
that's possible, but I may be a little too optimistic about that, but I'm trying.
So it sounds like the platform that you're building, or the platform that you want to build, is this project is a sort of like a common platform that people could use for, I guess, I don't know, a better discourse, to go back to that conversation element tied into facts and things that can be plugged in to kind of substantiate positions from different opinions. No? Yes? Tell me more.
Kind of. So I'm not trying to build a platform. I'm not trying to build the next Facebook. I'm trying to create a container within which Harlan and TheBrain, Prezi, maybe Zuckerberg and Facebook, I don't know, within which they can show up and go, all right, geez, how do we open up to each other? How do we create an environment within which we can be citizens and civil and advanced society instead of the stalker economy that we're in, or surveillance capitalism, which we're in already up to our nostrils, right? Instead of those models, which are now dominant for what we've done. So I'm really trying to create a place and a space and a series of ways of looking at the world that might bring multiple platforms together, bring multiple tools together, help us build credible data that we can share and improve, right? Thinking of the data commons, there are now data trusts. There's a bunch of interesting stuff happening in open science that we can borrow from. I mean, what's cool is that I'm not trying to invent a whole bunch of things from thin air. I'm trying to bring together a bunch of inventions that already exist, right, and say, hey, y'all, if you talked and you linked and you were more open than closed, a lot more open than closed, we might solve some of these problems together. And so there's not one platform I want to launch. I want to figure out, how do we live across these platforms? And if somebody invented the distributed platform you were talking about earlier, right, where each of us is running a piece of the server and we have a fragmented but shared and trustworthy relationship through the cloud, that's cool too. I would jump on that platform. I just haven't seen it yet.
Right. I mean, that's on a technical level. That's feasible in terms of, because heck, we could literally just do this through our phones in a way, and not necessarily appliances. Back in the day, we were thinking like this would be an appliance. You kind of plug it in, kind of like a router, and that it functions like your local computer, like zero maintenance and all that jazz. But you kind of have one.
A little bit what Holocene is doing.
Right, but now you're kind of like you're carrying one in your pocket all the time, and you make sure that it's charged because it's your window to the world. So I see
Exactly.
like bunch of different tools that you're talking about. What would be I mean, aside from like people who are in that mind space that care about the truth and the future and everything, fixing the world, all of that, right? How do you make that popular, right? I think that's the $1 million question over here, right? Because that's like, how do you convince people? Like the reason why people use like all these different tools like Facebooks and Instagrams and so on, it's because, in a way it's selfish of like finding out information that they want, and again, they get these, rewarded by all these actions that they do. How do we kind of mold that functionality, or mold that all that training that got in over there, the billions of dollars that Facebook spent into researching, psychologically how to motivate you to engage in this platform, to kind of be in this space that you're describing in this open mind project?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of water has already passed under the bridge, right? I'm early internet. I was on the internet early. I'm Twitter user number 509. Meaning I'm the 509th person to ever sign up for Twitter.
You need a T-shirt with that.
I should. I totally should have a T-shirt that said that. And life was more innocent back then. A lot of people, including a big piece of me, thought that if we just connect everybody and let people share what they believe and what's going on, things should be a little better. And then the platforms that ate those conversations ended up having as their business model the undermining of attention, not just the undermining of trust and data and the hoovering up of all my data to sell it off and so forth, but the undermining of my attention, as you described really nicely just a little while ago, of I'll just click on one more TikTok video. And I just have to say, I've only ever seen one good TikTok video. So please, somebody send me a good one.
Be careful
John
what you wish
Oliver,
for.
I know. John Oliver just opened his show with a TikTok video of a young woman doing fashion tips, showing how to curl your eyelash. And she says, and by the way, China is busy like torturing Uyghurs and, blah, blah, blah. And she says that with a perfectly straight face, and he runs with that for his show, which is about
I
Uyghurs.
think that's brilliant.
Right? It's completely brilliant. And so she's undermining things by kind of hacking the system in just a beautiful way. I'm all on board for that. But I also want her and him and the rest of us to have better tools with which to tell these stories, because John Oliver is sitting like you're sitting right now, and I would be his visuals, and it's like a slideshow.
Yeah.
It's like a slideshow, right? And there's a show called Patriot Act that has, I'm totally spacing on his name right now.
Look it up, TheBrain.
It's in my brain. I can look it up exactly. But he's standing on a stage which is completely animated, and he's basically standing on a stage that is complete. Hassan Minhaj, that's Hassan Hasan Minhaj Minhaj. It's a Netflix show. I don't know if it's still running, but he was sort of doing John Oliver, except he could stand in the middle of his data, and so he was surrounded by data. It's still not what I'm thinking about, but it's more interesting, right? So how do we move in these creative directions, and how do we soften up enough to other people is the big thing. Like one of my heroes here is a guy named Daryl Davis. He is a black jazz musician, a pianist, who met a guy in a bar many, many years ago who said, hey, I've never heard a black guy play Jerry Lee Lewis so well. And Daryl says, well, I kind of taught Jerry Lee Lewis how to play the piano. And they proceed to become friends. It turns out this other guy is a KKK member. And Daryl Davis at this point has a garage full of 200 or 300 KKK robes, because by being patient and going to their events and dining with them and listening respectfully, he won a lot of people away from the KKK.
Right.
And I think that's brilliant. There's a really nice documentary about his life. And I think that it's patient, loving, vulnerable work, and he's doing God's own work, It's fabulous. So how do we bridge that? How do I connect that act to Facebook? Right? What's the bridge that allows us to use Facebook, which is like everywhere, in a way that isn't we're gonna discover who the QAnon trolls are and flush them out of the system. Okay, good. I think. I mean, I think QAnon is dangerous and whatever, but I'd rather take QAnon members and say, hey, dudes, I know you're finding some good membership by being like feisty insurgents in, undermining democracy, but we could really use your help in fixing the planet. There's a lot of stuff that has to get fixed right now, and your energy, which is awesome, is kind of going down a way that might actually destroy us. So how about joining the party? I want that, right? And I'm trying to figure out what are the tools with which I can tell those stories, show convincing data, and memorialize it, so that we don't have to sit down now for multiple interviews trying to convince Trump that the U.S. response to coronavirus is a shit show, which it is. Like, that shouldn't be a conversation we're even having to have. He should be apologizing. He should be backtracking. But of course, politically, it pays him to not do that. Denial is not just a river in Egypt.
Right. The storytelling aspect of it, I think, is a critical component, where you have creative people taking the tools that you bring in to the table and spinning a I don't know, I don't want to call it a movement, but spinning an interest in storytelling by allowing to kind of mishmash all these different tools. And I agree with you. There's like not one to rule them all. That's like, this one is good for this one is good for this, in terms of like visualization specific things. But I think the ramp to the ease of use of those is what, if we can kind of lower that, so like everybody can kind of storytell, just like praise you with that zoom in feature. It's just so engaging, and it really doesn't take that much. I mean, it really is not rocket science.
Some visualizations that are missing are really very straightforward, and they're also storytelling tools. For example, my first computer was an Apple II Plus. But the first guy that tried to sell me an Apple II was selling me an Apple II right as they were going out of date, out of style, and I didn't know that there was a Plus available, and I would have enjoyed sort of having seen that. Scroll forward much later, I used to be a big fan of the little Canon portable image stabilization cameras, the IS 90, 95, 100, and I kept going. But with Amazon, I always wanted there to be a family tree of which products compete with which products. Like, when is a product obsoleted by the next one, and then who competes with this one? And if I wanted to buy a camcorder with these features, but I wanted the generation before, what is my competitive set? And then I pick from among those, right? That would be a useful shopping tool. Does Amazon offer us anything like that? No, nothing like that. Is that feasible? Of course that's feasible. Then no manufacturer actually wants their products compared fairly to other manufacturers' products. Everybody wants to sell you the older thing for a little more money, so incentives aren't great. But what if we had a storytelling tool that lets you say, hey, you're new to cameras, I recommend you don't buy the hottest and latest of these, go step back here and here's your competitive set. And used a tree, a product tree that gave you that. It's not, this is not rocket science, right? This is not rocket science. And so shopping would be a different kind of experience. And then you could fold into that storytelling about user experience with all of these, like, oh, I can't stand the Canon UX. Their software is always sucky in this way and that way. And then I could pick my way through because I would say, oh, the features this person hates about this brand, because their software keeps going through the whole brand line, are features I'm never going to touch. And the things that they like about it are things that I love, so I go here. And you could make much more intelligent choices. I mean, this is storytelling around shopping, around commerce.
Right.
And we don't have any of this stuff.
It sounds like there's a product over here.
The best we have is Marcus Brownlee doing really nice videos about the latest release of some phone or camera or whatever, right? That's what we got. That's state of the art.
Right.
And I'm trusting that he's going to give me a couple good opinions, and his tools are, here's the phone I'm talking about.
Right. That's well, so in a way, you're talking about structured transparency, in which the manufacturers, it would be in their best interest to kind of having this kind of almost XML-like structure.
We do it despite the manufacturers. We wouldn't need the manufacturer cooperation. We just need to sit down like Wikipedia and organize this. Like this could be this could be a follow-on project for Wikipedia, perhaps. One of the problems with Wikipedia is that it thinks of itself as only an encyclopedia. And an encyclopedia doesn't do this. But the information you need to do this is already inside of Wikipedia. Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. So,
come on, entrepreneurs, whoever's listening to this.
Yeah. Seriously, nobody's picked up and done that.
So, what do you think? What do you envision this project going in a year? What's needed to? What do you think is needed to kind of get it to the next level where you see it in terms of bringing in the components, bringing in all the components to kind of get that spun up, get that momentum, because that's what it is, right? If something becomes popular, suddenly a lot of people come in, and maybe you should think of it as a platform. Maybe a platform that has a lot of these tools that are just tools, because tools are just tools. Right. The platform is something that could be the kind of either repository or a distributed way of doing it, like all these different things. The underpinning it, but the key again is just it is people. It's people that would be the creative who would come into this platform, who would have vested interest in doing all of this work to kind of do the storytelling, backed by facts, backed by all the links and everything in a engaging way, and not one that just makes your eyes glaze over and fall asleep. And I think that might be part of the secret sauce over here.
And you asked earlier, why would vendors sort of want to jump into this and sort of collaborate in this way? And I think partly, why is there a lighting district in Manhattan? There's a lighting district in Manhattan because the lighting vendors figured out that when there's 6 stores and not one, everybody in town goes to that district, and their odds of getting somebody walking in the door and buying their lamp go up a bit. Right, so there's a flower district, there's a fabric district, the schmata district. There's a and when you cluster together, it actually sort of helps everybody's sales. So that's maybe a blunt force instrument, but if lots of people were coming in deciding to do this, that might help. Second thing is, and I'm not sure, I haven't thought this thing through all the way. Mostly business, commerce, is about sequestering some asset, owning exclusive access to it, and then metering out, access to it or use of it. How do we build successful business models on top of the commons? And by here, open source software is my best illustration. Linux and Apache are my favorite stories, and IBM is my favorite case study, where IBM, when I was a tech industry analyst, was a company about to die. The mainframe was clearly about to die. IBM had spent the better part of a decade trying to make its 5 platforms talk to each other. Its internal technologists couldn't do that. And then a few people who were internal sort of champions for open source said, hey, if we put TCP/IP on everything, and then we try this Apache web server, and then we maybe put Linux on, it might solve our problem. And bingo, it did. And so then IBM proceeded to dedicate hundreds of programmers that they were paying salary to work on those open source projects to make them better, because they realized that by improving the commons of the software, they got to use that software and sell $3 billion worth of consulting projects on top of the software.
Right. Yep.
So I'm trying to figure out, how do I get these tools cracked open and open sourced, and the data made reliable and distributed, so that we can begin to have these conversations about the interoperability of the tools, better, what kind of a platform-like thing emerges from all this, et cetera, so that we can be better citizens together.
Right. You hit something very important, which is, you need to make, if you want a platform to be successful, you want to find a business model in which people actually will make money. Because then if someone can channel and focus their creative juices and skills and everything into something, a product, a service that will yield them money that they can live off of, then now you have someone who's not going to be doing this as a hobby, as a favorite, as a fad, as a temporary, maybe, I want to save the planet type of deal. Like, now this is my business. I'm going to be the best that there is in this. And so I think that's kind of another side of the secret sauce over here to kind of find what is the business model. And the problem, again, is I think that information is free, or most of information is free by and large, and it's very difficult. That's why media companies are struggling, right? Like, how do you sell content where there's like so much of it that's for free?
So I read I haven't finished reading it, but I have one of my tabs open right now behind you, is an article called something like "The Truth is Paywalled, Fake News is Free."
Yeah.
By which it means media companies that are trying to dig up facts and present them to us still need to pay their reporters and their research and their platforms and all that kind of stuff. So while Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, everybody else, big paywalls. And every now and then they let some stuff out, in particular around coronavirus, which is good, but still mostly paywall. And everybody else who's trying to spin our heads is perfectly happy to pour tons of information into the infosphere, into cyberspace, to confuse us and spin us and say, no, that article is not worth it, or whatever. So it's worse than what you just said. Because anybody motivated to actually change our minds is just going to do it for free. And it's going to be easier to access. And what I hate about paywalls, what I particularly hate about paywalls, and about intellectual property protection, like DRM around books, digital rights management, is that it keeps those great nuggets of ideas away from us. I don't like that I can't link directly to an idea in a book in my Kindle reader, right? And I use Readwise, I guess, or something like that takes my highlights, and I can kind of use them, but not really, right? It's like a bridge halfway, but it doesn't really close the loop. Our best ideas are sort of maybe allegedly in these books that people are trying to sell us, and yet we can't actually instrument them and use them and share them and link them. So when I read a good book or watch a good talk or whatever, I debrief into my brain. And then when I debrief something, when I have an insight, I connect it back up to whatever else it refers to.
Right.
And just lather, rinse, repeat on that, and that's really powerful. It's really interesting, right? So I think there's more of that available, and I'm not trying to say that every human on Earth should be busy doing this, because half the people on Earth use Wikipedia, and it's being curated by, I don't know, a couple hundred people. I mean, I think there's tens of thousands of people who are correcting commas and adding images and doing whatever, but the core base of people who've built up most of Wikipedia is probably under a couple thousand, right? And guess what a great asset they've built. And I ask audiences, who has touched the Wikipedia in any way in the last month? Almost everybody holds up their head. Then I say, who has ever edited the Wikipedia ever? And 2 people hold up their hands. And that's okay. That's okay. So I'm kind of saying, if we had a medium that allowed us to express and remember and annotate and represent and share what we know in a much more powerful way, it could have the same sort of effect, because then, Jane could say, I like what Adrian wrote, over here, and include it in hers merely by including it. And your logic and your presentation and all that would be part of what she goes and presents. That'd be cool. I did a video I call Nuggets, Narratives, and Points of View that sort of is this. Like I want to be able to do that instead of damn death by PowerPoint.
Right. Which is what disconnects people from a topic. It's a lack of storytelling. When you look at Wikipedia, you're looking at hopefully you get you get facts, and obviously they do fairly good job in sourcing everything, right? But still, it's like it's not engaging. Like, unless you're a student and you need to do it because you have to do it for some reason, then it's like, it's not as engaging. Every single day of either fake or concocted or fabricated stuff that lives on the internet, because it's so much easier to create something that's going to go viral. Truth doesn't sell very well, so like it already is the underdog in this fight.
Exactly. I totally agree. Truth is sometimes it's boring and sometimes it's really uncomfortable. Is the other side of that? Like, American history is up for judgment these days, right? Because of things like George Floyd's murder. There's a whole bunch of systemic racism that has turned into a protest movement to take down monuments for racists in the past. And there's a thought in my brain before this movement showed up. There was a thought in my brain about U.S. military bases named after Confederate generals. I was like, wait. John Bell Hood was an asshole and a Confederate general. Why are there 2 Fort Hoods?
Right.
Like, seriously, people? Like, what was up with that? So that's getting cleared up, and I'm happy about that. But there's a whole bunch of people really unhappy about that, right? A whole mess. And that's just one of 50 different boils we have to lance in different ways. So it's really complicated, because the truth may be boring, but sometimes it's really like stuff you don't want to hear and stuff you don't want to accept or live with or own or be responsible for, right? Because that involves a loss of privilege. That involves doing a bunch of stuff that you didn't think you were ever going to do because you were born in a better, luckier situation than that. And that's like of the moment. Then I want to find a medium, a method, and a series of processes that let us have those conversations so that we can fix shit. Because it's broken.
If I give you a magic wand to do that, what would it look like? If you could have anything and anyone to help out with this, and to create the vision that you have in your brain and in your biological brain of how that could even look, paint the story how that would look. Remove all the stops, all the tech. Forget about the technology. That's just that's just the underpinning of it. But how would that function to kind of get people back from this look something shiny, squirrel, that kind of stuff, into like, hey, we it matters, we want to engage, there's storytelling. It's like, hey, I'd rather watch this because it's engaging, what have you, versus like maybe watching Netflix and just kind of numb myself by watching some fiction. Agreed.
So in the context of this Open Global Mind project that I'm working on, it's really early. This is only a couple months in. I'm trying to invite into the conversation at this point people who are generative, who are builders, who are doers, and who have big ideas. Because I've been in a whole bunch of groups where there's a lot of talking and not much gets done, which is the side I tend to fall on because I'm not great on execution. I'm really good at big ideas. And so I'm trying to invite people who love to execute and get things done. And some of them are losing a little patience because the topic is big enough that we're burbling over into a whole series of conversations. So right this minute, I'm trying to organize things enough so that people can find their way to a few people they want to do some sub-project with, and then report back to the main body. Hey, we're experimenting with this. Who'd like to be like our guinea pigs? Or we think we fixed this, or we think we found something. And then lather, rinse, repeat, because this has distributed, trustworthy data aspects that are way beyond my pay grade. This has governance and business model questions that I have an idea about, and I have a couple things I want to test, but I would love for somebody to show up who would like to run one of these businesses and say, sounds great, let's go start it. I already own a domain, a couple domain names that would be good platforms. Who wants to run with that and make it, see if it turns into something? So basically experimenting in many ways and converging toward a general idea of what this thing could be, which is not the easiest thing in the world to explain. So I try painting it and talking about it in different ways at different times, and I've got some co-conspirators in the middle of this who are sort of doing the same with me, and that is awesome. But if I could wave a magic wand, it would kind of be to have more people show up who understand this intention, to be able to explain the intention better, and then to have lots and lots and lots of profitable experiments run around creating the different moving parts, linking them together, convincing vendors to go open and come in and play together, changing their business models around, and using all of that to tell the stories that might fix the jam we're in.
This touches on something that I had it queued up in my brain as well, biological one. You mentioned open source software and how critical and how, well, let's call it that, really revolutionary in a way it is, how it shaped the internet as it is right now. So that's open source software. There is a movement of open source hardware, which is very, very interesting. I wonder if you've touched on that at all. Have you researched it at all? There is a gentleman by name Marcin Jakubowski who is I don't know if you saw his TED talk and
in my brain. I knew you were going to talk about him.
Yeah, and so.
Yep.
I met with him at his in Missouri at his open source ecology headquarters, and one of the workshops, and he is really trying to do what open source software did. He's trying to do that to open source hardware, but even beyond that, like this whole ecology-based collaborative effort instead of competitive. And we have this idea that competition is great, and it probably was for a while, where things competed and things were better. But we're in this place right now because of the internet and connectivity and all the tools that we have, that we can do better collaboratively and still have a business model in it. And that's what he's trying to develop and get people interested. So I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on it, because you're a brilliant man, and he's a brilliant man as well, probably a Nobel laureate at some point for doing this, if it takes on. And he is kind of struggling a little bit with, like, how do you turn this into a viable, self-sustaining business that people can participate in this and not be fearful of, like, hey, this is mine. I built a better drill, and I'm going to patent it, and it's going to be locked in for 10 years or 50 years or whatever the case may be. Instead of like, hey, here's something. There's still enough money for me to do this by supporting it, by building, but whatever. But we can collaboratively create something orders of magnitude better versus just like these closed loops of hardware manufacturers. So I was just curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So Marcin, he's in my brain. I've never met him, never had a conversation with him. I got to connect you guys.
I think it would be awesome. I had him on my podcast. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I met with him. I had him on my podcast. I'll send you the link. He is, big thinker. And I'm trying to think like how I can connect him with others who are, combine those forces.
Yeah. I think when the very first articles came out about him is when I put him in my brain. So I've been watching, and as I understand it, he was trying to figure out how do we open source plans for the devices, the machines that would help us create civilization. So build a town, plant crops, make tools, et cetera, and let's open source those plans. And I haven't really heard anything about the project in maybe a couple of years. So I have no news. I don't know what the current situation is. I don't know what's up. But I love the idea, and I love how they were going about it. And I think it was very complicated. I think that when you're talking about physical things that cost money that like need to move around, if you're just talking about data, like my brain data file, the cost of my brain data file is however much time I've spent in my life in the last 22 and a half years populating it. That's it. That's the full cost of my data file. That's not the value of my brain data file. I have no idea what that is, and I don't sell it. In fact, I publish it openly because I think it's valuable to other people who might stumble across it. The moment you cross over into physical stuff, building a viable business and competing against Caterpillar, Deere, Komatsu, and whoever, it must be just killer because none of them want to do that. In fact, they're opening a bunch of really interesting windows because Deere, for example, is hated by a lot of farmers because you can't repair your Deere tractor. You don't own the data that the sensors on your Deere tractor collect. They sell it back to you. Mm-hmm. Which, along with Monsanto and now owned by Bayer, is trying to own the seeds that won't reproduce that they want to, like, seriously. These companies are destroying agriculture, which means they're destroying human life, and they think they're so clever and going to make a lot of money. And I'm like, man, I wish that Marcin's project would actually take wings because if we didn't have to buy these expensive devices, but there's this chasm between the thing that looks like a Lego truck, like somebody built it out of Legos and solder, and welding device, and a John Deere fully automated air-conditioned push a button and satellite control drop whatever you want wherever.
Yeah.
Now, that said, the technology to collect data and drop what you want wherever, not so hard for your average PhD to make. That would not be hard to open source and do. OpenStreetMaps is a beautiful mapping app that has layers. You could like it's not like it's impossible. It's just like nobody's managed to bridge that gap. And doing so with a community of people is really complicated, never mind that business interests want to keep you from doing it. I'm a big fan of municipal broadband. And I have a whole lot of very geeky friends who are telecom experts. And I have watched as the cable companies and the telephone companies have fought an extremely successful rearguard action to keep cities from doing the very simple and inexpensive thing of installing their own fiber, dropping some repeaters on it, and selling access to media companies, which would more than cover the costs of maintenance, to do this. And instead, we have a duopoly in this country at incredibly expensive rates. And we've legislated everything very stupidly about this. Very, very stupidly, partly because we have regulatory capture, partly because this is sort of one problem nested on top of another problem nested on top of another problem, all of which need to be solved simultaneously.
Right.
Or all of which need to be undermined and tipped over at the right moment, which is the moment we may be in. Police forces, defund the police, which is the worst motto I can think of to convince people how to fix policing. But what they want is to fix policing. It's just that abolish the police and defund the police are the hashtags, because police reform has been tried for 50 years and failed. So police reform is not on the agenda because police reform has no credibility. So they haven't found the right weapon. But that's one of all these different kinds of systems that need to be toppled, and I would say redesigned from trust.
So
because the policing we want is everything based on trust.
Right.
The agriculture we want is agriculture based on trust. The business we want is business based on trust. But we don't have any of those. So
just a comment of defund police. I think that it's kind of like the pendulum is just swinging to extremes, right? It's kind of, it's not, this is how we fix it by defunding police. I think it's like, here's how we punish it. So it's a punitive action versus like a way forward.
If you talk to the people who are trying to implement defund the police or abolish the police, what they would like to do is actually brilliant. I don't think their pendulum has swung way too far where they want to get rid of all the police forces and just have us all live like Lord of the Flies. Mm-hmm. They actually want to fix the system, and the things they're trying to do, I support entirely. Their tagline sucks. The label they've put on this is horrible. Abolish the police, defund the police. Joe Biden is trying to distance himself from that as much as he can because he needs police forces on his side, because he needs people who believe police forces are important on his side to vote for him. But But if you go pry open the cover on what defund the police actually means practically, it's all fine. I have no trouble what these people are trying to do, none whatsoever. Police have no business doing traffic tickets. Police have no business doing homeless people on the street. Police have no business doing home disturbances that are basically a fight at home. None of these things should be police matters, not a one of them, but we managed to destroy all of the other institutions that we thought we had put in place to do these things. There's a whole, if you Google deinstitutionalization and look up Ronald Reagan in California as governor, you will see that we shut down all the sanitariums, and we were going to build sort of neighborhood homes that never really happened, and everybody ended up on the street or in jail or at the ER.
I feel like I opened up a can of worms over here, because I'm ill-equipped to talk about that because I haven't studied or researched it, so I don't even want to step into that ignorance of in that respect. So this is probably another episode that we may do, and aside from totally brain, and then we're just going to talk about those specific topics. So, but if you were going to give, go ahead.
Just briefly, and I'm an amateur on these subjects, but I care a lot about them, so I have a lot of stuff in my brain about them. I would love nothing more than to participate in those conversations with people who know a lot more than I do, who say, well, that didn't work, this did work, whatever, and then represent that and move forward and offer that up as a kit to any community that wants to do. New rethought policing, muni broadband, for God's sake, and a bunch of other things. Like, let cities and places repair themselves, because the politics that are above everything have screwed everything up, and a whole bunch of people are so fed up with the politics and the system that they voted for an orange-faced moron clown as president to break that system. And I don't blame them for that. I think a large number of Trump voters were like, the system is broken, my kids have a future that looks worse than mine, let's put somebody in charge who will destroy the system. And he's been scoring like a B+ or an A on that metric so far. Just look around. So that's a piece of his core. There's a whole bunch of other parts of his core base, but there's a whole bunch of people who logically voted for the guy who was going to destroy the system, because God knows it's not working for us, and maybe something else will show up that's better.
I see how that's what probably happened, because people were just so sick of stuff that was tried in the past and hasn't worked or hasn't worked well enough. And so that's kind of the reactionary situation where it's like, hey, we've tried all of this. We don't want more Clintons or what have you because it didn't work in the past. Well, this guy may be, extreme, but maybe that's what we need right now. We need a hammer to take hammer to everything, right?
Exactly.
So, but oddly enough, so this made me think that when you said, well, I'd love to talk to people who are, more educated about that and all that. Well, how great would that be to create a Kickstarter campaign to kind of get people interested in funding a set of, I don't even want to call them like documentaries because there's a lot of work done over there, but I think like to build like this platform that you talked about, the open mind, where you would bring the subject matter experts and then have people that could, in an appealing way, present that story and in a visual way and just basically serve those facts. So they would be beyond reproach in a sense, where you... Isn't there something done like that?
Yeah, two things. One, I like Patreon more than I like Kickstarter because Patreon is ongoing support, and Kickstarter and Indiegogo are just like one-time funding. And I think what you need is ongoing support. So I have a Patreon page. I'd love to get some help there. But the other thing is that I don't think there's such a thing as an unimpeachable argument or the perfect logical. And in fact, there's a thought in my brain that says emotion and membership trump reason most of the time. Mm-hmm. So emotion and membership trump reason most of the time, by which I mean people who want to stay members of their tribe will overlook facts and counterfacts and whatever else. They will happily overlook those things, and they will argue their own case, because not doing that means being cut out of their neighborhood, right? Cut out of their friends, cut out of the people, the friendships they had in grade school.
Community.
All of their community basically believes the same thing. So you will deny whatever. And if in the meantime somebody's been saying, and by the way, the newspapers are not trustworthy and nor is science, then awesome. That doubles down on the logic of your choice, right? You're done. And that describes today's reality. That is the world we're in right now. So I'm busy trying to build a platform to attract people to make better arguments and clearer arguments and tell better stories with this total knowledge that it's probably the story that hits you here in the heart and not the argument that tries to convince you here in the brain that's going to work. And maybe more importantly, it's probably breaking bread with the person you think is your enemy or the person you fear and realizing that they're human. So Daryl Davis, the guy I mentioned earlier, his sentence, the thing he says over and over again is, how can you hate me if you don't even know me?
Right.
And he's completely right. He's completely and totally right. And these people end up going, well, you're okay, but you're my friend. You're different. And then he's like, no. You don't know those other people either, right? And it can carry over. And part of the problem is that everybody fears that in changing their minds, they're going to lose their privilege or their status or their position or their community. And we need to figure out nice ways to show them that that won't happen, that they can cross that terrible stormy river and that they'll be fine on the other side. And that we're not doing that.
Storytelling, it's a key, man. It's getting into the emotional appeal through storytelling, bolstered by facts. But I totally agree with you. And boy, Jerry, you just opened up a can of worms on this. I often when I speak with my guests over here. I'm in Utah over here, and I invited candidates for Senate, Utah Senate, and House of Representatives. And those are candidates who are, they weren't incumbents, new people coming in. And I said, look, I want to give you a platform to, I feel like I'm sort of like I try to be apolitical, and I want to open up a platform so you guys can talk about things and we can have a discourse-based conversation and not this what I call sports mentality politics. It's my team versus your team. It's these labels. It's the object is win and lose. That those are the only solutions versus things that are can be built and discussed on merit. Ideas that can stand on their own instead of being kind of sideswiped by this is from Democrats or this is from Republicans. Therefore, it might be very polar opposites and you just discount it instead of talking to the point of the idea, right? So I just wanted to briefly mention that because I agree with that is a lot. Those two components that you mentioned, it's the emotions and it's the membership, which I call basically labels. A label is you're Republican, you're this, so your mind is already closed. This is coming in from this party or this party. You're already looking through a lens, right? Instead of trying to.
Membership is the human thing behind the label, I think. Because the label is too easy to sort of separate as an abstraction, where membership is the people I see at church every Sunday and the people I talk to at the grocery store and when I drop off my kids, the people there. That's membership in your tribe. And tribe is not a great word here, but your community, your group. And label doesn't take me to the human parts of it.
You're right. Maybe that label is one level up of on abstraction level. In community, in membership, you have that relationship, which is the core element of it. Whereas, label doesn't necessarily have that. So that's going to be another topic that we're going to talk about in the future, ladies and gentlemen. Cool. Well, Jerry, I really appreciated our conversation. I wanted to give you just a little platform for a shout out where you want to leave the audience as a message. I mean, we talked about, to kind of briefly summarize, we talked about the brain and mind mapping and organizing data, but those are just tools, right? Those are the things that allow us to do tasks, to organize our insane world of overloaded with information. Then we talk about a bunch of interesting topics and how we can. What is the future of all of this, right? We see what's happening in terms of people being overwhelmed, overstimulated by all these different social media platforms. You're trying to be everywhere. Things get lost. Things don't get retained. We have this, Dory syndrome where we just kind of short-term memory and just kind of peel off. And
I'm going to steal that. That's great.
That's what I call myself. And when I talk to my guests, I said, like, you know what, my wife is a mental health counselor. She says that this whole podcasting over here and talking to interesting and super smart people is very therapeutic, because I'm like Dory from Finding Nemo. I'm like, oh, this is so awesome. And then she's like, just peel off and you just go in somewhere else. And so I need these atomic conversations that can be closed in within an hour or 2 or 3 versus projects that will go forever, that at some point, if they're not challenging or stimulating enough, I will lose interest. So that's the Dory syndrome.
I totally love the Dory syndrome, and we are all suffering from it. It's like we're being driven toward being Dorys through all of this that's happening.
Yeah.
So sorry, are you done with your question?
Yeah. So this was just me trying to kind of summarize what we talked about, but I wanted to give you the platform to kind of just give a shout out and tell the audience. They can find you at several places. We have one of them is jerrymichalski.com. That's your main website, but also you have jerrysbrain.com, and so you can visit those, and there's a bunch of links that will take you to a bunch of other links and other things that you do.
Exactly. And I'll name some of them right now in a sec. Years ago, I've only been to South by Southwest one time. This is the conference held in Austin. And I only went once, and I happened into a session where Ginny Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, was interviewing Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist. And it was like a 90-minute interview, a good long interview. And in that time period, both of them said, roughly, people are generally more trustworthy than we think they are. And if you think about it, both Craigslist and Wikipedia depend on people behaving in some trustworthy way. Otherwise, these things wouldn't exist, right? And we can go deeper into those mechanics. But that's a really key sentence for me. People are generally more trustworthy than we think they are, but we've ended up in a place where our civilization thinks that most people are not trustworthy, that anybody could ruin everything at any time. And so we've gone and designed our institutions from a basis of mistrust of the average person. So my tip to everybody is assume good faith, which is a really nice sentence from open source collaborations from other places. Assume good intent, and then figure out what to do when somebody falls and screws up, and that will inevitably happen somewhere. But your life will be much better if you assume good intent in all the things that you do. So I have a bunch of websites that might be interesting here. Designfromtrust.com is one of them, which talks about these sorts of things. I've got my TEDx talk is up there, a couple other videos I've shot about these issues. Then I have openglobalmind.com, which is about the platform-ish thing that we discussed here together. And then I do have a Patreon account. So it's Patreon/What If We Trusted You, which is the name of my TEDx talk and the name of the book I need to finish writing. But I just like a serial book with words just one after the other. Every time I start sitting down to do that, I'm attracted by this brain thing, by this future of how we might think together. So I'm not sure that the book is ever going to happen, but I do have a Patreon account and would love support on that. And Adrian, thank you. This has been a really enjoyable and thought-provoking conversation. You ask fabulous questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to kick all this around with you in a good, slow way.
Thank you. I mean, that's the theme for the show. Conversations with interesting people about interesting topics that bring value, and for sure there's a ton of interesting stuff over here and a lot of value for people to extract, and if they visit your website with your brain and get into that, they will be lost and enthralled for years to come to find all those interesting topics that are interlinked and interwoven that tell a story. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being on the show. I mean, it's these types of experiences where you talk to someone who gives you a wealth of information, but also interesting perspectives that shape our minds. And that's kind of like the basis of discourse in my book anyway. So thank you again for being on the show. Really enjoyed it. And we got to give thanks to Harlan to introduce us for it, and I'm going to leave you with a little homework of introducing me to somebody else who you think is interesting to you, and who you think would be interested in doing this show with us and bringing in their own perspective. So I'll reach you offline about that. So
Excellent.
Thanks again.
Cool. Thank you very much. It's been great.
Excellent. So until next time, thank you, folks, for being on the show, for surviving this long. Jerry Michalski from jerrymichalski.com or jerrysbrain.com. Check out his stuff. Amazingly huge brain, biological, and the one that the mind mapping one that he built out over 22 years. I've looked at it, and you can find so many interesting things, so much content that's interestingly linked, that I think if you're going to check it out, is going to really open your mind to this wealth of knowledge and how you can organize your own thoughts. So. Also check out TheBrain.com, which is the application that we've been talking about in the beginning of this podcast, which is allowing you to do this unbelievable mind mapping and collection of information and shaping it the way you think, so that you can find stuff that's important to you at the time when you need it. So check it out. Until next time, I'm Adrian Sinclair, and this is The Adrian Sinclair Show. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to The Adrian Sinclair Show. You can find previous episodes on the Apodcast multi-channel network at apodcast.com. You can also stream this podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Podbean, and other audio platforms. And if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, you'll get convenient short summaries of podcasts you may have missed. So check it out. And lastly, please support us by sharing our episodes on social media. We really appreciate it. Thanks.